ICH E20 for Adaptive Designs presented by Dynamics nQuery. Today's webinar provides you an overview of adaptive designs and regulatory context that led to the recent publication of the ICH E20 Adaptive Designs for Clinical Trials draft guidance, which is a major milestone for the adoption of adaptive designs in clinical trials, especially phase 3 confirmatory trials. I'll provide you an overview of the principles established in ICH E20 for running adaptive designs, some of the specific designs and special topics that might be of interest based on this guidance, and some of the documentation requirements that are discussed in the guidance as well. I'm also providing you an overview of some of the analysis that's occurred there in the public sphere about the guidance so far, and therefore some of the changes you might see between the draft guidance we have available right now and the final guidance, which we may see in around a year or so. So before we get started, just some frequently asked questions. Firstly, this webinar will be recorded. Yes, the webinar is recorded, and the recording and slides will be sent to you after this webinar is complete. If you have further questions, there's a questions option in your webinar software. If time allows, I'll answer questions at the end live. Otherwise, I'll answer all of your questions via email, including if you have ideas of certain adaptive designs you would like to see in nQuery. That kind of feedback is very valuable here as well. So my name is Ronan Fitzpatrick. I'm the head of statistics here at nQuery. I've been with the company over a decade, and obviously that decade has seen a huge shift in the usage and interest in adaptive designs. And we're very excited to continue to hopefully provide you solutions in nQuery for those types of designs. In terms of our agenda, we're going to first provide an overview of what adaptive designs are, and then the regulatory context existed up to now, and then an overview of the kind of introductory section of ICH E20. And then we'll get into the meat of ICH E20, which is design principles and the areas of interest, which would include specific adaptive designs that are covered, and also some special topics such as Bayesian adaptive designs or time to event survival adaptive designs. As mentioned, conclusions and discussions at the end if time allows. Today's webinar is brought to you by nQuery, the complete solution for optimizing your clinical trial designs, including adaptive designs. And that ranges from preclinical research to post-marketing phase 4, but obviously confirmatory phase 3 trials being the main emphasis, including for adaptive design. If you have any questions about things that may or may not be in nQuery, please go to our website, w.statsolves.com. Notice nQuery is a tiered product ranging from base to expert, with the pro tier being the adaptive design tier, and obviously that's our most popular tier with our clients, and obviously going to be a major focus of what we'll be looking at today in terms of the options available in that tier, such as scriptural design or multi-arm, multi-stage designs, and so on. If you want detail on what's in each of these tiers, there's a URL in this slide that you can use to go to that page and see more detail there, or you can go to our website, statsolves.com, for more. So part one, we're going to look at what adaptive designs are and the regulatory context up to this point, and then kind of a brief introduction to ICH E20 itself. So adaptive design, what are we talking about here? Well, we're actually going to use the definition from ICH E20 itself. Note this could change, but I would expect this to be exactly the same if I was a betting man, or to be very, very, very close. So basically, an adaptive design is a clinical trial design that allows for prospectively planned modifications to one or more aspects of that trial based on interim analysis of accumulating data from participants in the trial. So we're talking about a design where we're planning to make modifications. So if something happens, we can make a change to that trial based on that data. And that might be one change, it could be multiple changes, we could be changing the sample size, or stopping early, or adding an arm, or dropping an arm. And we're basing that on the interim analysis of accumulating data. So we have data coming from the patients as the trial is ongoing, and we now have access to that information, whether blinded or unblinded, and we're going to use that information to make a change in the trial in a principled fashion. And there's a wide variety of adaptive designs that are available for clinical trials at all stages, but at confirmatory stages, we're usually talking about early stopping or group sequential design. So if there's very strong evidence that our treatment works or it doesn't work, we stop the trial early. For example, very famously, 4 or 5 years ago now, the COVID-19 vaccine trials were all versions of a sequential trial where all of the successful ones stopped earlier than the maximum sample size that they had planned for. Sample size re-estimations, where we increase the sample size of some of our pre-trial assumptions end up being correct. For example, our standard deviation estimate being lower than what actually occurred in the trial. Adaptive allocation, where, for example, we allocate subjects more to arms that are doing well versus those that are doing poorly. And arm selection, which is kind of a variant of that, where we're dropping or adding entire arms to the trial. And the focus of ICH E20 and indeed the FDA guidance for 2019 was on confirmatory trials, but note that adaptive designs are very widely used already in preclinical research, in public interest trials, in early stage phase 1 and phase 2 trials. But we'll focus here today on the principles which are important for phase 3 trials in particular. So for example, type 1 error is something that will come up a lot in phase 3 trials, which may be still of interest, but perhaps not quite as stringent in preclinical or early phase research. So adaptive design adoption has been increasing as regulatory acceptance has become more prominent, and you've also seen a much wider availability of software, of training, of expertise. So for example, there's publicly available resources such as Panda from the University of Sheffield. There was training run by eCrate last year as well. There's software such as nQuery, or there's publicly available software like trialdesign.org. And all of this basically means adaptive design has become much more widely available than it would have been perhaps 10, 15 years ago. And so, for example, even within the 2010 to 2020 period, where the regulatory context wasn't quite as friendly as it has been in the last 5 years, you still had 317 adaptive trials published in the literature based on a review by Ben Tricky et al. In 2024, and 59 of those were phase 3 as well. And that doesn't include all the ones that aren't published, like, for example, the failed trials and such. So obviously, there was growth in that period. It's accelerated since then, since the 2019 FDA guidance, and we expect that to continue to grow, especially with this now harmonization of regulatory perspectives across the globe, thanks to ICH E20. So this ICH E20, and we'll talk more about the ICH and why it's important going later on, but basically ICH E20 adaptive designs is a major milestone. Even this draft version, obviously the final version will come in around a year or so, and this one will provide you an overview of what I expect the impact of that to be, and then break down ICH E20 in detail and provide you an overview of what's in there and what might change in the final version as well. So in terms of adaptive design and the regulatory context for that, that's kind of evolved significantly over the last 20 years or so. So I think the first major milestone was the EMA reflection paper on adaptive design in 2007. But I think the general perspective on that guidance now is that it was quite conservative, that it basically said that adaptive designs, there's a tension between doing an adaptive design to making changes to the trial and the confirmatory nature of a phase 3 trial, and that therefore there needed to be a strong justification for adaptive design usage, what might be termed difficult experimental situations. Like, I think if you're talking about the shift since between then and now, like that type of language would probably now be limited to, for example, rare disease trials, where certain compromises, say, on type 1 error control might be acceptable from the FDA that may not have been acceptable 10 years ago, or other types of things. And I think like the general path has been that openness to adaptive designs has certainly increased, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And I think the FDA 2010 guidance, which was more open than the EMA guidance, I think was generally understood, but there was this big bugbear about this idea between well understood and less well understood adaptive designs. And the perspective has come from industry in particular, from people who are involved in this area, is that this language of well understood and less well understood basically created a barrier that less well understood designs, if they weren't already in the bucket of well understood, there was a strong disincentive to try and push the boundaries of what adaptive design could be, and that therefore this led to a rather static guidance, which didn't encourage innovation, that did encourage unlocking the value adaptive design could do in terms of increasing efficiency, getting more information from trials, and so on. And so the FDA 2019 guidance was a major positive shift. So basically, this replaced the 2010 guidance completely, and effectively it established a principle-based approach to adaptive design, while still providing useful design and domain-specific guidance, on specific designs such as early stopping, or group sequential designs, or sample size re-estimation, and also in areas like time to event analysis or Bayesian. And I think effectively, this established a much better foundation under which people could not just do adaptive designs right now based on what's happening in current practice, but what would innovations look like? How would that do? And you've seen that continue via programs such as the Complex Design Program, which was started in 2018, which has really pushed the boundaries forward in terms of Bayesian borrowing, in terms of complex adaptive designs and such. And so, there is a context here. There were a legislative push, say the Individual Cures Act and the various PDUFAs that happened during this period that pushed the FDA in this direction, but there was also an internal push from various people like Dion Price and Lisa Lavange, who were pushing forward the FDA's fairly conservative stance on innovative clinical trial design. And so the increasing popularity, the legislative push, internal push within the FDA has really made adaptive design a much wider, a much more popular option for clinical trial design at the confirmatory stage. And you can see here a quote from Scott Gottlieb, who was the FDA commissioner at the time, like, adaptive designs have the potential to improve study power and reduce sample size and total cost, and basically make drug development more successful, more powerful, get more drugs and more pharmaceuticals and more solutions into the hands of patients that can help stop the diseases that obviously continue to be an issue to this day. And of course, it's not going to be a major focus here today because we're talking about phase 3 trials, but we have also seen this, increasing adoption happen in other types of trials like master protocol trials, which include umbrella trials, basket trials, platform trials, and we've seen the EMA also come into a more, I suppose, a friendly approach to that via their complex design Q&As, platform trial concept papers. And even in terms of things like, say, the concert extension of adaptive design, that increases the availability of resources for, if I'm going to do adaptive design, okay, here's a checklist of all the things I need to have if I'm going to be writing up a paper or a protocol for such adaptive design. And so ICH E20, Adaptive Designs for Clinical Trials, is this major milestone. So, the ICH, the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, I'll just call it ICH from here on out, is a organization that was established to harmonize the regulatory requirements for pharmaceuticals around the globe. So this is a entity that exists to basically bring all of the major regulators together, whether that be the EMA, the FDA, the Japanese regulator, the Chinese regulator, the UK regulator now that it's left the EU, and basically they come around and they basically try to find common principles that can be accepted across all of those entities if you're going to be bringing a marketing application or some other application to those regulators. So this is a really big deal because if it's in these ICH guidances, then you can go, okay, I did X, Y, and Z because it's in the ICH guidance, and then you can take that to each regulator, and then they will say, oh, well, we've adopted that guidance, and therefore we accept that that's a principle or an approach that makes sense from our perspective. And there's a variety of steps here, a 5-step approach that there's a brief step here on the right-hand side. And ICH E20 initially was, proposed in the concept paper in 2019. I think what I've heard is that the initial hope would happen in 2 or 3 years. Events happened, primarily the COVID-19 pandemic. That meant that they got delayed, and that meant that the draft guidance only came out in June 2025 on the ICH website. It was then published separately by the various regulators, such as EMA and US FDA, over a period of time since then. And the scope of the ICH E20 is focused very specifically on pre-specified changes to the design or study conduct of confirmatory clinical trials based on within trial accumulating interim data. So what that means is that they don't spend they don't spend much time, if any, on unplanned changes. So if something happens in the trial that requires you to make an unplanned change, that's not something that this is trying to cover. The FDA guidance, for example, does cover that briefly, but it's basically explicitly removed or not considered here. Early stage trials or exploratory trials are only briefly very mentioned in the ICH E20. External data, or more accurately saying that decisions made purely on external data are not considered. Things like borrowing are considered. We'll talk about that later on. Or routine monitoring of, say, low recruitment and stuff isn't what we're talking about here. We're talking about we're going to be making a change to the design or to the study conduct. So, for example, stopping the trial early based on this accumulating interim data. And it provides an overview of the advantages and challenges of adaptive design, these key principles if you're going to do an adaptive designs, guidance on certain types of adaptive design, and then special topics, considerations, and an overview of the documentation requirements. And there's a public consultation that's open in the US, EU, UK, and other jurisdictions as well. But these 3 main English-speaking jurisdictions, the consultation is open till the end of November. So I provided actually the URLs if you want to go to each of these regulators' website where they have different mechanisms for providing comments. And very conveniently, the ICH E20 working group has been doing various presentations. The one that I could get that's publicly available online is the one from EFPSI in 2025. That's the European regulator meeting. And this is what's called Moving Towards Harmonization of Confirmatory Trials with Adaptive Design. And this provides this is a summarized version of what they have on a slide there, but basically talking about the types of things that they're interested in getting in the comment period, in the consultation period, that they think would be important. So, focus on content, focus on how it maps onto the concept paper published in 2019. Is the level of detail correct? Avoid editorial comments unless there's some ambiguity you believe is being caused by the language. And then they are specifically mentioned that Bayesian methods, which mostly focuses right now on borrowing and to a shorter extent on use of basic criteria as the mechanism for doing adaptive design. Is there more that they should be doing there in terms of improving trial interpretability? So they're asking specifically for Bayesian design. So that's one area. I would be surprised if there wasn't some level of change between the draft guidance we have available right now and the final guidance, for example. And so in terms of the trial advantages and challenges, this is a kind of overview of the kind of things that are mentioned in ICH E20 in the kind of opening parts of the guidance. And so I think the big advantage at a high level is the kind of greater flexibility versus a fixed term trial. So in a fixed term trial, you set your study inclusion exclusion criteria, you recruit a bunch of subjects, you get your follow-up, and then you do your analysis. Nothing happens between when you start the trial and when you do your analysis. You basically just do the study and then you analysis. Whereas obviously with adaptive design, you have the opportunity to increase the sample size, to stop the trial early, to make other changes to this. And if you're thinking philosophically, if there was some platonic ideal of what the trial would be, if you knew all of what was going to happen beforehand, the idea is that the adaptive design will get you closer to that platonic ideal than you would have got by trying to predict exactly what's going to happen before the trial even occurred. Now that you have interim information, that you have information coming from the actual patients in the real world, surely that will get you closer to that platonic ideal of what the trial could have been if you'd known everything beforehand. It's useful for safeguarding against inaccurate pre-trial design assumptions. So I think, for example, sample size re-estimation, we're obviously making assumptions about the variance, about the effect size. Being able to increase the sample size if those happen to be wrong is something that makes a lot of sense. Or if we do the group central design, if we were kind of picking a Goldilocks between, something that, not the minimum clinical interesting difference, but not the, optimistic but great difference. If we're picking something in the middle, then, we still have optionality to still be able to find that MCID, or still having a chance of stopping early if we have a much better effect than we expect. That's the kind of things we get by early stopping, for example. Obviously, ethically, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like if you're stopping a trial that's futile early, that means less patients exposed to a treatment that doesn't work. If you're talking about responsive adaptive randomization or a treatment selection design, obviously if you're dropping arms or if you're randomizing more subjects to arms that are performing well, that should, in theory and in practice, lead to more patients getting the treatment that actually works versus the arms or the doses that don't actually have the same efficacy. You should see higher statistical power on average. So, for example, an equivalent group of design can be shown to be, give you more power for less sample size, an equivalent fixed-term trial. And it should also potentially lead to improved understanding. So, for example, you might have more flexibility to understand the kind of cost-benefit information at dose-finding trials. So, for example, if you're doing an adaptive dose-finding trial, where you have, say, response adaptive randomization, or you're doing a seamless trial, you may be more willing to invest time in that because you're going to see more information going into the doses that actually matter. And if it's seamless, you might also see, because you're going to be able to take some of the information forward to the main trial, you might make that phase 2 trial larger because you know that data isn't going to get thrown away when you move to the confirmatory stage. It's going to add some value, and so you're willing to invest a little bit more money and a bit more time, and so there's a bit more understanding you can get from a clinical trial, the adaptive versus a non-adaptive one in those contexts, based on the kind of cost benefit and the economic assessments, etc. So in terms of challenges, obviously the logistical issues are substantial, or should certainly be at the top of mind if you're going to do adaptive design. For example, maintaining trial integrity and maintaining the blind is a little bit more difficult for adaptive design than for a non-adaptive design. For example, if the adaptation is occurring, if people are aware of what the adaptation was supposed to be, then that adaptation occurring could give them information you don't want them to have about what actually happened with the interim data, that the interim data was less good than expected or was better than expected. And obviously maintaining the blind for the trialists themselves, for the participants, and for the sponsor is obviously an essential component, not just of adaptive designs, but of clinical trials in general. It's just a bit more complex for adaptive design than for a fixed term trial. Additional time and expertise required for complex planning. So obviously these additional resources, this additional thought, the expertise required to do the planning, these are all things that will get easier over time as more and more types of adaptive design become standardized within the industry, but there is an upfront cost that will probably always be there versus an equivalent fixed term trial. So obviously you need to assess that the benefits, the advantages talked about here on the left are worth that additional cost. The analysis issues, so there are statistical issues such as type 1 error inflation, biased estimates, and confidence intervals. So in some areas this is fairly well developed, that there isn't much of a risk here, like group designs. It's all fairly well understood at this point, or relatively well understood. Whereas for other types of more complex adaptive design, these things might become much more of an issue and needs to be sorted through. And this is where, for example, simulation might be very important, where you can at least establish that the chance of something going very badly wrong on terms of bias or type 1 error is quite low for all of the plausible scenarios that you've considered via simulation, even if there isn't any analytical way to prove that. There's potentially less information for safety assessment. So I think there is a big point here that, a clinical trial, obviously the primary outcome, say overall survival in a survival trial, that's obviously really important and what you're really building the trial around, but there is obviously safety, adverse event endpoints that need to be considered. There's secondary endpoints, and you need to ensure that your interim analyses, for example, the choice to stop early, isn't inconsistent with getting sufficient information on those other endpoints, and that should be actively considered within the trial, either actively within the adaptive design infrastructure itself, or at least within the decision of when to do an adaptive design interim timing, for example. And then there may be certain scenarios where adaptive design just doesn't make sense. So, for example, if you have very fast enrollment, going through all this extra effort may not make sense. If you have very slow follow-up, you may end up in a situation where you have an interim analysis and you have like 10% of the trial already recruited, already going through the processes, but they're not going to be part of the interim analysis in terms of the decision making. And then there's a whole question of, well, what do you do with that additional 10% of people? Like, you've already accrued the cost of them. Obviously, in terms of the guidance, it will basically say you should do the analysis with and without that 10%. But the more important thing is that from an economic point of view or from a practical point of view, does adaptive design make much sense in the context of very slow follow-up, where it takes a year, 2 years to even just find out what the outcome actually occurred is. And so in terms of choosing the appropriate adaptive design, there's kind of generally some kind of overview of what's provided there in a section in ICH E20. And it basically says, I propose adaptive design requires a clear and compelling justification. And they talk about understanding the potential tension between confirmatory nature of a trial and making changes. And I think this is, get editorial for a second. I would say that this guidance broadly follows the ideas in the FDA 2019 guidance, but that some of the language probably follows a bit closer to the EU reflection paper or the EMA's thoughts on this. So I think some of the language, not negative, but perhaps is cautionary, conservative on this, is coming from the EMA perspective, but the actual principles, the actual things that they say in a positive sense, here's what you should do, or here's that I think you should be thinking about, I think broadly those follow very closely to the FDA guidance. So I think this is an example where you require a clear and compelling justification. I think that's fair enough in itself, but adding almost two adjectives, clear and compelling, is almost saying this is a special thing that you need to justify. And I think that makes sense in the context that adaptive designs, obviously, they have additional costs, they have additional complexity that is added to the trial by doing them. So there is a good reason to not just go willy-nilly into adaptive design, but there's a somewhat of a case to be made that's saying that there's a tension between, like a philosophical tension between confirmatory nature of a trial and making changes to the trial. It goes a little bit maybe too far in kind of saying that this is a risky thing to do rather than this just being a more difficult or more complex thing to do. Careful consideration of clinical and statistical aspects of the clinical trial design is required. I don't think anyone would disagree with that, whether it be about adaptive designs or about clinical trials in general. So I think, this justification needs to be in depth and needs to talk about the added value. So we think this will increase the power. We think this will provide additional information. We think we'll be able to, look at more doses, have a higher probability of selecting the right dose because we'll do more doses because we're going to do a seamless trial versus the risks and costs and how are we going to protect the trial integrity, if you're talking to the sponsor, even, you might want to think about the cost and stuff like that, but talking to the regulator, the trial integrity needs to be ensured. They need to be, fairly convinced that you know what you're doing, that you're not just putting a plan together for a fixed term trial and just pretending it's then just adding adaptive design stuff, that you have the documentation changes, the kind of documentation things that they talk about, like say, for example, a annex to the IDMC charter for the adaptive design rules, for example. That's the kind of thing they're saying maybe you should consider that. And you must consider the effect of the type, number, and complexity of adaptations. So it's not just pick an adaptive design. You need to think about, okay, how many times am I going to do an adaptation? How complex are these adaptations going to be? So there's a much big difference between, choosing to stop the trial early, which is fairly well understood at this point, and doing response adaptive randomization. That's not to say that the latter doesn't have a lot of value. It does, but it's just, the kind of statistical theory and the and some logistical things are more difficult for that type of design. So you need to be showing that you know what you're doing and that you've considered that. And the curriculum design with a lower number of looks will be easier to justify and execute. So the more adaptations, the more things you throw into this into this stew, the more difficult, the more work you're going to have to put in to justify that. And I think that's going to be true regardless going forward. But of course, you will see that as certain types of designs become established and have well-established principles in practice from people who are willing to push the extra mile, that will lead to those designs becoming more and more accepted over time. It's, effectively, regulation is a Burkean type of enterprise. You basically, once something's established, we kind of move forward and kind of say, okay, that's fairly standard. And, I think there's frustration within some people that that's the way that regulation works, but it kind of makes a lot of sense for an entity which is obviously dealing in a scenario where the incentives of the regulator and of the sponsors aren't always necessarily aligned, right? Like the regulator is there to protect the public interest, whereas the sponsors are there to maximize their economic value. And therefore, a regulator has to have a certain skepticism of innovation to ensure that the surface area of innovation isn't being used as an excuse to lower evidentiary standards. So basically, you want to avoid regulatory uncertainty about the validity of your adaptive design results. Like, you don't want to end up in a situation where you do adaptive design, you take a bog standard naive estimate and a bog standard CI, and you take that to them for analysis in terms of cost benefit analysis, and they go, well, this is biased, and we can show that the bias via simulation is quite high. You need to go back to square one on that, or we're not going to justify it based on what you've given, and then you do the bias adjusted one, and it's lower, and then they say, well, this is not approvable anymore. And obviously the justification should compare the chosen trial to comparable trials, be its operating characteristics, so its power, its type 1 error, its reliability, the expected number of subjects that are going to be in the trial, the expected sample size. And simulation is a really valuable tool for this, and it's talked about specifically in the 5.2 section, what's required to do simulation for adaptive design. And what I would say here is that I talk about later on, it's like, comparing multiple designs. There's kind of multiple levels to this. I think there's this idea of in silico exploration of exploration of clinical trial design, or in silico clinical trial design, which is the idea that you use simulation tools to basically evaluate a wide range of potential designs, including adaptive designs, and then you compare them based on their operating characteristics. And then, you take that design that wins to the end. And then there's a question of, well, how many designs do we include that were part of this kind of journey from like our first trial design, a fixed term trial, to the one we actually chose. And I think the general principles that are being established here is that you're talking about comparing kind of a comparator, like a standard trial, a fixed term trial, a potential trial, versus your trial if you're going in a more complex direction, and that there should be that comparison there rather than having like every single trial that was considered there, because that can often lead to more confusion, because many of those operational aspects or those trade-offs are for the regulator as much as they are, for the sponsor as they are for the regulator, right? In terms of the economic aspects, in terms of the, for example, futility rules are more for the sponsor than for the regulator, and those things need to be considered as well. So in terms of the adaptive design principles, what are we talking about here? Well, effectively, there are 5 principles that are established in the adaptive design principles: the adequacy within the development program, adequacy of trial planning, limiting erroneous conclusions, the reliability of estimation, and maintaining trial integrity. And these happen to actually mostly map on to the FDA 2019 guidance principles. The only difference being this adequacy development within development program principle is added basically as almost this kind of meta principle, which is like, okay, obviously there's all these things once you've chosen to do adaptive design that you should be thinking about to ensure it's done adequately, but you should also think about, okay, how does doing an adaptive design fit within the overall development program, the program of going from a proposed drug to something that's actually going to get approved? And I think especially in the context of, say, the clinical trial program from phase 1 to phase 3, there's lots of questions about that there. And so I think there's just a general, I think, statisticians are always basically like, you need to understand what you're trying to achieve in your clinical trial before you even talk about the clinical trial design and then talk about your development program. And so you need to think about what are the clinical questions that you want to answer there. And I think that maybe one criticism people have is that there's a bit of overlap here with the adequacy of trial planning aspects that we'll talk about in a moment, but also there might be another criticism that, well, this is really more principles that make sense for any clinical trial, right? Like, it's not that adaptive designs, need to be specially considered within the development program, but it's more that, development programs and thinking about the development program is a really important thing you should be doing from the start. And I think some would argue that, the nature of certain adaptive designs, such as seamless trials, actually makes you think about things that you ultimately didn't think of that up to that point. I think there is currently a major shift happening in the idea of clinical trials in general. So, for example, there's been a shift in the FDA leadership, which seems to suggest that seamless trials are going to be a major area of focus in the near future. And that's also in the context of competition with Chinese regulation, where there's a much faster move from especially preclinical to early phase trials that certain like former FDA commissioners are talking about, being a major disadvantage for US innovation. So this is actually something I'm talking about in the 2026 things to look out for in clinical trials. But I think basically, it's very easy to kind of say adaptive design, you need to take special consideration of that within the concept of a development program. I think the main thing they're trying to get across here is that, doing an adaptive design is not a substitute for thinking through your development program carefully and thinking about why you're going from A to B to C to D to get from, your very earliest human trials to the actual approval of that drug. And I would say that some people have said, for example, Scott Berry from Berry Consultants, that they believe that maybe some of the language here implies an anti-seamless design bias. And I think that's not an unfair assumption. I think that will get cleaned up in the language approach. And I think that the point that they make, for example, something I said earlier, which is that, if you're doing a seamless, say, phase 2 to phase 3 trial, so from dose finding to confirmatory, they argue that in their experience, and they talk about some of the actual trials they've run themselves, that if you have a response adaptive randomization, or if you have the ability to bring data forward from phase 2 to phase 3, or both of those, then you're more likely to actually invest more time in phase 2, because that data is not going to get thrown away after phase 2. It's going to bring forward to phase 3. And so the actual dose finding aspect is invested more time, more effort, more doses are evaluated, and therefore the chances of getting a positive result from phase 2, which is picking the best dose possible, will actually occur. And that's obviously got huge value. So I think they talk about, for example, their case study, usually the Trulicity trial from Eli Lilly was a good example there. So I think this point will probably still exist, but I imagine there will be pressure to kind of make this a more positive orientation rather than the current, I would say, negative interpretation, which is, please don't use adaptive designs to replace actual trials, basically. Don't do one big adaptive design to replace a whole bunch of individual trials that we think have value. And I think, there's certainly debates about, for example, the change recently from, a move in direction from requiring 2 confirmatory trials versus a single large pivotal trial. So there's a whole debate happening there in the background about that anyway. And so then I think once we get past that, we get into basically the same principles, albeit in a different order, than the FDA guidance. So we have the adequacy of trial planning. So I think, if you're talking about adaptations, you need to justify them. And I think there is a general bias that, you should limit the number and complexity of adaptations in a confirmatory trial, because things like the rest of these things, like erroneous conclusions, reliability, and trial integrity, are going to become more difficult the more of these things you throw into the mix. And so there is a general bias here against going too complex. Now, there are programs like the Complex Individual Designs program that I discussed earlier that are kind of pushing the horizon, but unless you have specialized knowledge internally, or you're willing to go to entities that have specialized knowledge, the general thing is okay, don't go too much over your skis, or you may end up in trouble. So keep that in mind. Obviously, you need to plan the type, the rules, the timing, all of the operational considerations of the adaptations themselves needs to be pre-specified and justified. So I think this is a huge thing, just to say these things need to be pre-specified. Pre-specification was a major emphasis of the FDA guidance. It's a major emphasis here. You can't just say we're going to change stuff. I think one thing I would say, and it's maybe a little bit of a criticism that comes across from certain people in industry and from who've in the public sphere, is that this is established as a really strong principle for the sponsor, but there is also a little bit of wiggle room, it feels like, in terms of how the actual implementation of adaptations, when you actually get into the room with, say, the IDMC and their decision making, that it's not always made clear that that the IDMC has to follow these rules rigorously, and then that calls into questions all of these other things, because if you base all of the erroneous conclusions, reliability, based on this specific plan and justifying everything here, and that can just be kind of hand waved a bit, or nudged around a bit by the IDMC separately and obviously in a blinded way. That does call into question, well then, how are you going to ensure that those type 1 considerations, etc., are going to be kept for the trial design that's close to but not quite the same as what was initially planned. Just note, obviously, some adaptations require stronger justification. They give the classic example that a blinded adaptive design probably requires less justification than unblinded, because obviously that doesn't require access to it doesn't have effects on the lesser effect on the type 1 error, less effects on operational bias overall. And then obviously there's preference for methods which are robust to deviation from initial design. So for example, a simple example would be group central design. You're probably going to use error spending approach because that's much easier to adapt and change in response to like say the timing of the interim analysis being different from the initial plan than some of the older adaptive designs such as Hey Biddle Pedo or like the O'Brien-Fleming design or Wang-Xianis. Limit erroneous conclusions. Basically, you want to avoid incorrect conclusions for efficacy, safety, and the benefit risk. So obviously, these are all important. Obviously, there's a huge emphasis on the demonstration of type 1 error control. I think in the confirmatory space, type 1 error control is just one of those things that's going to continue to exist. I think there will continue to be criticism of that. As Bayesian guidances come out, for example, the FDA's Bayesian guidance, that might become more of a topic of conversation. But I think this ICH E20 fits very much within the philosophy of ICH E9 and other guidances that the alpha, the type 1 error, will continue to be something you will need to demonstrate control of under the null going forward if you're going to be doing adaptive design in a confirmatory phase 3 trial. So that area, like I think they call it erroneous conclusion because they don't want to talk about errors and the whole philosophical debate, and they don't want to exclude like Bayesians. But the type 1 error control is basically still there, and it's still probably going to be 0.025 for most trials, unless you're in a specific area such as like rare diseases, and you can show strong justification for moving beyond that. Reliability of estimation. So obviously, regulators are very strong to emphasize that you don't just get a significant p-value and suddenly the drug is magically approved. That regulators take into account all of the evidence, including the hypothesis testing, but also the estimates, the intervals around those estimates, and how they fit within that new therapy being effective or having value to actual patients in the real world. And therefore, estimates need to be reliable. They need to have low bias and ideally low variability, basically, fairly small intervals or small intervals that can still be considered statistically legitimate. I think the bias, if you pardon for the bias, is against bias. So if you have an estimator which reduces the MSE but has non-trivial bias, that's probably going to get more short shrift than one that has zero bias but a high, fairly higher MSE. So in the terms of the variance bias trade-off, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, I'd say bias is the thing that they care more about still. I think there is some criticism of that perspective, that kind of very much focuses especially on type 1 errors rather than type 2 errors. But I think that's basically where it is right now. I'd say the language might be softened a bit, but that general perspective that bias is a larger concern than variance will probably still be there in the final guidance. And basically, you need to ensure adaptation is based on reliable estimates, which is basically just to say, if you do an adaptation or an estimate way too early based on way too few subjects, then we're going to be a bit more skeptical of that. So perhaps you should consider your interim should be a reasonable proportion into the trial rather than say 10% of the way into the trial, unless you have a very strong justification for doing so. And there's other reasons for doing that. For example, not having reliable estimates for safety endpoints, secondary endpoints, which is kind of almost another aspect of that. But even just in terms of the primary endpoint, that's still a relevant consideration. And then maintaining trial integrity, the blind is given a lot of detail here. Maintaining the blind is essential for trial integrity and to prevent operational biases. So, for example, if the blind is broken, then if one arm's doing poorly and people find that out because that arm gets dropped or is being it's getting responsive allocated less subjects, then people are less likely to want to be part of that trial in the first place, and then the entire program can fall apart. So, the IDMC needs to be given appropriate skills to evaluate an unblinded interim data. You don't want to put people in there who have experience of doing this. They need to be people brought up, and obviously expertise is increasing all the time, so keep that in mind. And logistical issues and the blinding adaptations existence rules must be considered. So, obviously the logistical issues of if we're say increasing the sample size, where is the sample size increase going to happen? Is it across all centers? Is it just in certain centers? And then also that interacts with the idea that certain adaptations such as like response adaptive randomization or sample size estimation, in theory one could get a sense of how the trial is going based on that adaptation occurring at all. effectively. And so basically, how do we create rules around adaptations and around the documentation and the access to information such that doesn't occur or can be minimized to the greatest extent possible. And so, principles are obviously essential to establish the reliability, interpretability of adaptive designs. And this obviously applies to all types of adaptation, all types of statistical approaches, and effectively, like most of these principles, also apply to all types of design, fixed term or adaptive or whatnot. Bias, I would say, in the guidance seems to be, keep things limited. Like, unless you know what you're doing, unless you can show true value, we're usually going to be biased towards doing like probably one type of adaptation and doing that over a limited number of interim analyses. So basically, parsimony is probably the best way of describing their view of what you should be thinking about in terms of adaptive design. So, no more than what's necessary. And basically that means that if you're going to push the horizon of adaptive design, if you want to get out there and kind of, try things that you believe will add a lot of extra value, you probably will still continue to need stronger justification. But the good thing about the principle-based approach is that over time, these principles are fairly similar. And as long as the case studies and the examples aren't too stringent, which I think some of them are, but I think overall not too bad, that I think this should evolve over time to be to make sense and to be acceptable going forward once those kind of principles are established for your type of adaptive design. And of course, you will see, of course, that if you have blinded adaptations or you have adaptations that can be shown to be robust in terms of low bias and ideally low variability as well, that you'll probably have lower barriers to usage than if you have unblinded adaptations or if you have fragile estimates and stuff like that. So I think there's a very strong focus on ensuring that the outcomes and estimates from a trial are valid. I think this kind of fits into the thing, like a type 1 error, obviously still very important, and p-values very important and all that kind of stuff going forward, or establishment of type 1 error for a basic criterion. And there will continue to be criticism of that, but I think that's going to be stuck around because basically I get the sense that regulators want to have at least one criterion that they can kind of just put their hat on and kind of say, okay, unless you're in a very specific scenario, such as like rare disease, we just need you need to be this high to enter type criterion. So that's basically type 1 error. I'm not even sure if Bayesians would want, like, say, an equivalent posterior error threshold to be established, since it goes against the idea of like kind of Goodhart's law problem. But effectively, type 1 error is probably here to stay, and you're going to need to establish that under a null hypothesis that you're not going to have more than 0.025 or 2.5% chance of an error. But basically, I think a big emphasis that, like, look, we also need estimates, we also need confidence intervals, we also need other, analysis of how well the drug actually performed in terms of its actual, clinical effect, and that all feeds into the regulatory process. So make sure that you've established, say, via simulation for complex designs, that the estimates, the intervals that you're giving us are accurate and have low or no bias. And then the longest section is on trial integrity, because this is obviously huge, because basically there's a huge concern that a poorly run adaptive design can easily lead to information leakage that is less likely in a fixed term trial. And so there's often these practical, often subtle costs to the loss of the blind, such as low enrollment when there's a perceived, okay, this trial is going well, let's get on to another clinical trial, or subjects don't want to get recruited to that trial. There's obviously the very high risk of assignment bias, where people are getting assigned to the arm that people think is the good one, or the one that they should be on, quote unquote, rather than the one that they should be randomized on to ensure that the actual statistical inference is accurate. And so therefore the IDMC is essential for adaptive design. The independent data monitoring has a huge role here, even more so than in a clinical trial. And basically you're adding on a whole additional area of work for them that doesn't exist for a standard IDMC, where they would usually be focused on safety and other operational aspects. Now you're saying, okay, you are going to be the ones, this independent data monitoring are about making the adaptations. And so, you want to limit the information that goes into making those AD decisions to the IDMC as much as possible. And effectively, the IDMC might require, will usually have a statistical group to assist them, an SSG. They may even, I think the FDA guidance suggests, though not the ICH E20, that you might want a specific adaptation group, adaptive design group, or adaptation group within the SSG, or as a separate group from the SSG, which is specifically just dealing with the adaptation part. But effectively, there needs to be clear firewalls ensuring that information does not leak beyond the IDMC and the support staff that it has available to it. And that's obviously going to come under pressure from various people. Like the sponsor would obviously love to have additional information, but that is obviously essential to clinical trials in general, but it's more consideration because obviously the IDMC is looking at, if they're going to be doing adaptations, typically the effect size. They're going to be seeing how well the drug is performing so far, and then making a decision, okay, let's stop the trial early because the drug is really effective or really futile, and not just, as it's tradition, basing that mostly on safety information. As I said, consider, there is a consideration or maybe a bias here again that maybe, maybe a less granular adaptation plan is better than a more granular one, which is to say, if you have, okay, if conditional power is exactly 0.68, n is 201, if it's exactly 0.69, it's 202, etc., that maybe it would be better to have more granularity, where it's basically maybe there's only like 2 or 3 levels of sample size that should be considered, because there's a chance of back calculation if you don't do so. And I think that, I think that will probably get some criticism, especially people who are advocates of response adaptive randomization, which is basically one of those areas where I don't think it's realistic that the IDMC can run a truly response adaptive randomization, which is happening live, for lack of a better term. But that will, I think there's a general bias here. Okay, like maybe consider dialing it down in terms of how granular the adaptation is to ensure that back calculation is limited and you can have well-established rules. It's probably just easier to run as well, to a certain extent. And then evaluate the evidence for any operational changes after interim analysis. I think this is probably one area that will be controversial, in the sense that, okay, you see something that seems to be different after the adaptation. Okay, how do you prove that's due to information leakage versus just, the trial, like temporal effects happening over time? I think it'll be interesting to see, what are the standards of evidence required to establish that the regulator believes that the reason that there was a change after the interim analysis is because there was information leakage or there was some other failure of the adaptive design that led to, operational changes. So I think it's a useful thing to mention, but I think when that actually turns into actual regulatory work and talking about that kind of stuff, it will probably become a lot more difficult, and could end up being subject of several lawsuits if it actually was used as criterion on which to reject a IND or the other type of marketing application. So that's kind of the principles, and I think the principles, as I mentioned, very, very close to the FDA principles. I think the analysis is broadly similar. They do give some case studies. I think the case studies may get some pushback in terms of being a little bit too limited. For example, their approach to the seamless trials or kind of dose-finding trials might be seen to be a little bit restricted. But I think overall, the principles in general will be mostly go by without too much controversy. And I think the only thing is maybe, will the adequacy development program be retained, or will it just be maybe emphasized, okay, this is something you should be thinking about regardless, but there are some certain things you need to think of specifically for adaptive designs that might be a little bit more interesting. And then we get to the ICH E20 areas of interest, which basically can be broken down to specific designs covered and special topics of interest. So, the designs covered are early stopping, sample size adaptation, population selection, treatment selection, and adaptive allocation. So early stopping effectively group sequential designs, where you're going to stop the trial early if there's strong evidence for or against the treatment being effective, so efficacy or futility. And you basically just need to demonstrate type 1 error control, and that the interim timings and stopping rules are justified. So once again, if you have 20 interims, that will probably have more evaluation or skepticism than if you have 3, 4, 5 interims. And there's almost like a rule of thumb that you should have like 2 or 3 interims, but that's just a rule of thumb, and I think there's plenty of justification why you have. But obviously each interim has its own cost, just in terms of the operational costs and stuff like that. So I think most of the value from interim analysis can be extracted from not that many, but that's where simulation can be useful to kind of just see that holds true for your particular design. But I think having a starting assumption, okay, don't have too many interims, is not unreasonable. Using methods that are robust to timing deviations, using adjusted estimate, using non-binding futility bands. This is mostly non-controversial. So for example, this probably means that error spending would be the typical approach, especially used for efficacy bounds. And obviously it does mention in passing effectively that efficacy bounds are going to usually be more skeptical or more conservative there, basically have a lower chance of stopping early for efficacy than you maybe have for futility, because obviously that's what the regulators care about, that making sure that you're not being overly liberal in terms of stopping early and not getting enough evidence for the treatment actually working. Adjusted estimates, there are well-known methods for adjusting the estimates. There is still debate about which ones are the best ones, but basically to ensure that the estimate is unbiased or is biased downwards, because obviously the idea here being that if you stop early, the chance that you just randomly jumped ahead above the efficacy bound, and then if you ran the trial further, it might have come back down, regression to the mean. That is legitimate and needs to be adjusted somewhat to ensure that the unbiased estimate is brought a little bit down, shrunk towards the kind of expectation if you hadn't stopped the trial early. And non-binding futility, I think there is some analysis. Okay, well, if you've non-binding futility, like who's going to be making decisions about futility? Is it going to be the IDMC or is it going to be the sponsor? So there's probably some debate to be had there. But I think the idea that, like, let's not have methods that are going to lead to type 1 error inflation unnecessarily when the non-futility and the futility binding futility bounds are likely to be very, very close to each other is probably why they're doing that there. And once again, just avoid early looks because you need to think about your safety and secondary endpoints. Avoid naive estimates and constant intervals, and think about the overhang data. So, for example, if you're doing interim analysis and recruitment is ongoing and you're getting an additional 1, 2, 3% of subjects coming into the trial, I think what they say is that you should do the analysis if you stop the trial with the interim data and without the overhang data, and then one with both, and see would it be basically a basic sensitivity analysis whether that made a difference or not. I think there will be some back and forth in the comments about whether that's the appropriate strategy or whether there should be a bias in favor of one or the other, or whether there should be more specific guidance on what the best approach to doing the latter or the former analysis is. But I think the general idea of just doing both and just making sure that it doesn't change the conclusion is probably going to be the end point of general principle on that. Sample size adaptation, blinded, it makes sense, but requires pre-specification and demonstration type 1 error. So I think the internal pilot approach where you don't do adjustment, I think certainly, I think they're happy enough with it, but basically you just need to do a bit of simulation to establish that's true. So for example, if you have a large trial for a superiority hypothesis, it's probably grand, but if you're talking about non-inferiority or smaller trials, maybe consider doing a simulation or using some kind of mechanisms such as a weighting mechanism or inverse normal type test to ensure, combination test to ensure the type 1 error control is maintained or guaranteed. Unblinded needs a clinical justification that the weaker significant effect sizes that you're saving, which is kind of the language used by promising zone advocates, are justified, and also to ensure that the size of the potential SSA is realistic. You don't want to have like 10 times the original sample size being SSA. You're probably talking about magnitudes of closer to 1.5 to 3 kind of being the maximum ratio you would see between the original sample size and the unblinded sample size. I would say that it's given, it's a justifiable design, but there is criticisms of this design, including by Scott Berry, for example, in his recent podcast in the interim. So I don't know if the unblinded sample size estimation, it may not be a design that necessarily can be used that much going forward. What they do recommend is that you use the weighted SSA criterion. So this is what the CHW design, the Kui, Hung, and Wang approach, or the adaptive group design of Wasmer and Gurnall and Wadsworth, and both of those use weighted test statistics. So basically, the weights are usually based on the original size of the the cohorts of the interim cohorts rather than on the adjusted size of the cohorts. And that basically means that the CDL approach is probably where you can technically do sample size re-estimation in very specific limited situations about affecting type 1 error. It's not that they probably say it's not allowable, but I think they give a specific guidance or principle that they think the weighted statistics should be used. So that means that I think CHW will probably continue to gain in popularity in SSR versus or SSA as it's called here, so sample size re-estimation, versus the CDL approach, would be my opinion. Adjusted t-tests, adjusted estimates for bias and stuff like that. Once again, methods less well established here than for sequential designs, but there are things out there. There's a recent couple of good review papers on constant intervals and estimates in adaptive designs, and they're in the references at the end of the slide deck if you're interested in knowing more, that they were published this year. Population selection, so this is where we enrichment trials and similar. So subgroups of interest may have adaptive hypothesis or allocation. So you might be, if the treatment works in a say biomarker group, but not in the wider population, you might switch to hypothesis, say, using gatekeeping or similar, and maybe perhaps an adaptive way to basically change the hypothesis from it works everywhere to just works in this biomarker group. And then maybe you also have a situation where you just stop recruitment in all of the non-biomarker groups, or vice versa. The biomarker doesn't work well. Some biomarkers do well, some do not. Just stop allocation to those. I think you need to pre-specify the subgroups you're going to look at, like what are your actual subgroups that you were looking to potentially enrich. The rules for allocation need to be established, and I think there is a mention that if an out group's going to be stopped, then you need to have a plan for that. I think there is a fair amount of pushback on the idea that you need to establish that basically the out group that the in-group and the out-group, there needs to be comparative analysis of those two, because I think the principle is that, you know, like if you're running a clinical trial based on inclusion exclusion criteria, you know, it's you're not expected to then compare, okay, it actually works in the excluded group within a clinical trial. So why does it make sense within a biomarker driven trial or enrichment trial that, you know, we now need to establish that, you know, it works for this one, not against some pre-agreed, you know, like based on the randomization within that group, but also against the groups that you said it doesn't work for. That it seems like a difficult thing to justify based on the people who are criticisms of this very high barrier of entry for a enrichment type trial. So, you know, obviously you will need strong justification for why you're choosing the subgroups in the first place, of course, and that the analyses will not be biased. I think there's some analysis that maybe, you know, this population selection also probably should include the basket trials area as an additional area alongside kind of more traditional enrichment trials. Treatment selection, so this would be your multi-arm, multi-stage type designs. So select the best dose, treatment interim analysis and pre-specified set of treatment options. So I think dose, you know, like a MAMS for dose response just makes a lot of sense. For multiple treatments, it makes a lot of sense as well. Albeit maybe more platform trial areas, like kind of, you know, labels for existing drugs than for phase 3 confirmatory trials. But you need to pre-specify the groups. You need to pre-specify the rules, like how many arms are going to be dropped, what are the criterions for when arms are going to be dropped, and then what are you going to do with the dropped arms. So, for example, are those patients going to be reallocated back into the trial on the other arms that have been found to be effective, or they've been dropped, or what's going to happen there? And you need to have a large enough interim for reliable arm selection. So you need to show that, you know, the probability of selecting the correct arm over a variety of scenarios is high because you've given enough information there to get a reasonable estimate. And, you know, and you do need adjusted testing estimates because, once again, obviously, if you're picking the best arms, and some of that might be due to random chance, then you're going to have some bias upwards in terms of the estimates from the quote unquote best arm, best performing arm in an actual clinical trial. And adaptive allocation, the primary focus is on responsive adaptive randomization. So basically allocating allocating patients to the arms which have the best response so far, which show the most promise in terms of their therapeutic effectiveness. Covariate adaptive randomization, which includes things like minimization and such, which was given a decent amount of coverage in the FDA. It's basically only given a cursory mention here, perhaps suggesting that they don't believe covariate adaptive randomization has as much value or as much interest as RAR. And basically, you just need, for RAR, you need to balance the probability of assignment to the better arm with obviously the potential bias and type 1 error inflation. I would say that they go fairly strong on saying that the time varying effects, that like basically the effect of time, basically, you know, the effect size, the effect changing over time, you know, different types of subjects coming into the study over different time, for example, because new centers have opened or certain centers have closed within your trial. They give that a very strong assessment that can and almost will cause type 1 error. And, you know, and basically, I think I would say that their approach to RAR is quite skeptical, and I would be unsurprised if that gets a lot of pushback. And I've seen some public comments that suggest they will get a lot of pushback on that. I think they're raring to go to kind of say, like, okay, like, yes, this is a problem, but we have methods, we have approaches that can minimize this issue, and we think the benefits, especially, you know, getting more people into arms that make sense. For example, in a dose finding study, we can assess more arms, more doses, because we're not going to be assigning everyone 1-to-1 to 1-to-1. You know, that value can outweigh, you know, these risks, which we can also mitigate using various strategies, both within the trial design itself and within statistical methodology as well. And so I'd say early stopping, blinded SSA, fairly justified with appropriate safeguards in terms of both the operational bias and you know, with the appropriate estimates, appropriate strategies for unbiased estimates or low bias estimates. Unblinded requires stronger justification because this idea of like saving lower effect sizes, you need to make sure that those lower effect sizes are worth saving, and also the operational bias of, say, back calculation is explicitly mentioned as being a concern. And I think they, as I say, they basically go for the weighted approach using CHW, adaptive groups into design. Does that mean CDL, promising zone, is on the way out? I wouldn't go that far, but I would say that, you know, if you're going to do a promising zone design, CHW probably will get a less skeptical approach to it because it has strong type 1 error control. Population allocation only recommended in limited circumstances. I would get the sense that they're kind of saying, you know, enrichment trials, basket trials, which they don't really explicitly mention, but are kind of in the same bucket. Maybe better for early stage exploratory setting. I think there's going to be some criticism of that, especially in terms of seamless phase 2, phase 3 trials. But which is also true for RAR and treatment selection. But yeah, I think that will come up. I think a lot of criticism would be like there are certain areas, for example, rare diseases, where I think this type of approach would add a lot of value and is very important. I think you're seeing that, for example, the CID program and the rare disease programs from the FDA, and that requires some mention at the very least in this guidance. I think is what I get the sense of, and also maybe easier to justify the hypothesis changing a little bit, or the gatekeeping procedure being adaptive than adaptive allocation to some extent. But I'd go back and forth on that maybe. Then treatment selection MAMS is, I get the sense it's preferred over RAR just due to it being easier operationally, and also I just feel like the biases that are induced by RAR, which is obviously very fine-tuned, very granular, they feel that has a larger effect than the kind of more basic MAMS treatment selection, where obviously you're getting to an interim and you're dropping or adding arms, and that's kind of, these chunks are fairly self-contained. Each of them is kind of almost a mini trial, so it's a bit more tractable when you map onto how confirmatory trials run generally. So these are both targeting the same idea of like getting more subjects onto the best performing treatment or dose. And I think that the type 1 error, the bias warning for RAR is very, very strong. I think that will get pushback. And I think, I think their suggestion, or almost I think their compromise within the text of basically saying maybe you should do RAR but over a smaller number of interims. So rather than doing it adaptively on a consistent basis, just have 3 or 4 times where you're going to do RAR analysis and then do some adaptive allocation there. I don't know if that's going to fly, to be frank, but I think it's an interesting decision to kind of say there is this maybe midpoint between a full MAMS design and a full RAR design that might be a better midpoint than going, saying that these are the 2 kind of poles and these are the 2 options you consider. Just to mention things that aren't mentioned, like CAR, as I said, gets a minimal mention. Suggest that I don't think the value of covariate adjustment is really seen as very valuable. Like, you could just do a covariate adjusted analysis. That seems to be the direction of travel. So CAR, minimization procedures isn't really that much valuable. And there are certain things like endpoint selection and where you have multiple adaptations that were covered in the FDA guidance that aren't covered here. But I would say that the endpoint selection aspect in FDA guidance is quite small. So I don't think you're necessarily missing that much. I think it's kind of integrated into certain kind of examples in other areas. So for example, in the context of time to event trials, for example. So in terms of special topics, further considerations of data monitoring, they basically recommend a minimum of 1 statistician with adaptive design experience on your IDMC, including alongside ideally an independent statistical group or SSG to run the required analyses. And then, it's not, as I said, it's not in this guidance, but it might be added. Like maybe there needs to be a separate, almost adaptive design subgroup within the IDMC or the SSG to deal specifically with making the adaptive design decisions, rather than leaving that to the, the discretion of the IDMC itself. And obviously you should be limiting the group assignment to these entities basically at all, or certainly as much as possible. Adaptation recommendations should be made to a separate group in sponsor from trialists. So in the vast majority of cases, information passed will be blinded unless there's a strong justification. So basically, don't pass adaptation information to anyone who doesn't require it. So basically, ideally, the sponsor would have its own small subcommittee that's in charge of adaptations that isn't interacting directly with the trialists themselves, so that they can make decisions that ensure the trial integrity is maintained. And ideally, that plan will be, obviously, that plan should be pre-specified. And then the alignment between sponsor and IDMC on the full decision-making before the trial is important to ensure trial integrity. And as I said, there is some tension over the course of the guidance that maybe the IDMC is given a bit, sometimes it's basically said pre-specification is important, we need to make sure that things are there, and also the IDMC should basically have a bit of flexibility in making things. I think I would imagine the final guidance might be a bit more stricter in saying, okay, basically planning is where you should sort all this stuff out, go through all of these scenarios, do your simulations, rather than kind of relying on the IDMC kind of having to thread the needle between what's planned and the AD plan, adaptive design plan, and okay, what they think might make sense from a clinical point of view, or what you want to extract from the thing. So I think I would be surprised if it's a bit more restrictive on the IDMC itself a little bit going forward as well. For simulation study, there's a really long, very detailed section talking about using it to validate operating characteristics. So your type 1 error for the null case, that's really important. Power, expected sample size, trial duration, ensuring that your intervals and estimates have good operating characteristics like low bias and low variability, your stopping probabilities, and this should be for a wide variety of scenarios, whether that be different enrollment rates, different types of nuisance parameters, different types of effect sizes, et cetera, et cetera. And I think they do mention this idea of in silico design of, it's very useful for comparing different development programs, different types of adaptive designs and different options within an adaptive design, and it recommends iterative comparison versus a benchmark design. So this might be a simple group central design or a simple fixed term trial. And I think, once again, doesn't necessarily mean that every single trial you consider needs to be in the kind of package of documentation you send on to the regulator, but it probably means that maybe some idea of what the journey was might make sense. And obviously this benchmark versus what might be considered the standard design makes sense as well. Should cover a plausible range of assumptions with appropriate justification for the grid of scenarios shown. So you can't just pick randomly a set of scenarios. You need to justify why you picked that set of scenarios, and maybe include why you believe this worst case scenario is actually a realistic worst case and not just one that you picked that more worst cases could very much happen. It's impossible to simulate under every nuisance parameter configuration consistent with no beneficial treatment effect is a direct quote from the guidance. I would say there might be some pushback in this, just because saying impossible to simulate under every nuisance parameter suggests that this is simulation is not a comprehensive way of establishing type 1 error control. I would say that they might make this language impossible. Maybe it's a word that has a strong intonation, and it might just say it's impossible, but in a kind of more a way that makes it more clear that may be impossible, but we can establish type 1 error control can be shown for realistic scenarios, and emphasize that impossible doesn't mean don't do simulation, or simulation isn't enough. You need to provide detail on the data generating model. They recommend at least 100K for type 1 error control, and then maybe less for other operating considerations such as power or stuff like that. Well, power probably they still require higher, but maybe some other operational things might be acceptable, but for key ones like type 1 error, 100K at least. And then you should have a detailed simulation report for the adaptive design justification, and then there's 11 sections in this simulation report described in ICH E20. I won't go through all of them here today. Bayesian adaptive designs, basically Bayesian methods need to be justified, and that the same principles apply for Bayesian adaptive design as for frequentist adaptive design is basically is the headline thing. They get mentioned that Bayesian criteria for early stopping, such as posterior probability, are fine. They don't have any really issue to them, as long as you can establish that those stopping criteria still have good operating characteristics, like type 1 error, etc. External data and Bayesian borrowing is giving a significant overview. I would say there's definitely been feedback that maybe external data and Bayesian should be just in different sections, because there are frequentist ways of doing borrowing, and that that there's an overemphasis here that Bayesian and borrowing, basically dynamic borrowing, are being over conflated. So I wouldn't be surprised that the Bayesian, the external data or borrowing is basically put into a separate section in the final guidance. And basically they do go over in good detail basically how external data borrowing should work, basically justification over not using it, evaluation of the sources and quality of external data. So for example, patient level data is preferred, perhaps over preferred, and basically how dependent inferences on the external data. So showing how strong does the prior have on the actual inference for a variety of scenarios. And note this, as I mentioned, this is one area where the working group is looking for active solicitation of additional ideas about Bayesian usages in adaptive design. And I would mention that the FDA Bayesian guidance is now overdue, so that might provide some useful information for people to kind of make that decision. But obviously, given the current context, it's unlikely that the FDA is prioritizing getting the Bayesian guidance out. In terms of time to event analysis, interim analyses are often based on reaching target events. So basically, that's just saying that because events is a random variable itself, that means that there's great uncertainty over when the interim analysis happen, and basically the timing in terms of safety endpoints and other endpoints. You're basically not going to have as much control over knowing when the interim analysis is going to be as for say a continuous endpoint or a categorical endpoint. So just keep that in mind. Note that if you're going to do sample size re-estimation, that you could increase the number of events by either just waiting for more subjects to have the event who are already in the study, or by increasing the sample size. And I would note that there's no mention of the bias of this, particularly on the non-proportional hazards that was mentioned in Bradley and Korn paper from 2017. I think that's something they should include, because that strategy of whether to wait or increase sample size, it can be shown to have an effect on the bias of basically the likelihood of getting a significant value or getting a non-significant value. You can basically enrich for your preferred outcome. So for example, if you have a delayed effect, you're obviously going to be biased to waiting longer because you don't want to have the delayed effect in all these new subjects you're recruiting. So I think that needs explicitly to be mentioned, and I think there is some additional kind of like, I don't think it should be in this guidance because non-proportional hazards and that whole area is basically subject for the whole other guidances or whatever in the future. But I think it needs specific mentioning that this is something you probably need to pre-specify what your strategy is going to be for how you're going to increase the number of events. I think that needs to be pre-specified, and that needs to be explicitly mentioned. Adaptive designs, it says, are straightforward if the subjects involved are only used in one stage. So basically, everyone's in this stage. You kind of get to the end of the stage, you make a decision. But all the remaining subjects are censored. I don't think that's realistic, and I don't think that's going to happen. And I think it's fine. They do mention it's fine if the interim analysis is based on the primary endpoint and the final analysis is based on both the primary, that's probably fine. It can be shown to be fine. But then if you're going to be using a secondary endpoint, so for example, progression-free survival for your interim analysis decisions, but you're going to be using overall survival for the final analysis, that's where issues come up. And I think surrogate endpoints, secondary endpoints is one area where the FDA guidance did give some attention that this guidance doesn't, and it kind of, I think I think this time to event area maybe suffers a little bit from that because it kind of gets stuck in here as being maybe a case where this issue becomes more important, but I think this is important in general, personally speaking. So you may need to limit the design space to prevent these issues. Just be aware, there might be certain restrictions for time to event endpoints in adaptive designs you might not have in other areas. For exploratory settings, they basically say there's greater flexibility. General principles here might apply. Ensure the adaptive design does not prevent the generation of valuable evidence related to it. So basically, don't replace a bunch of larger, don't run one trial to adaptive design if you could have run multiple trials. I think this will probably get a lot of pushback. It may even get fully removed. We'll see. But I think they explicitly say in the forward, this isn't about exploratory setting. So I think bringing it in here at the end, even though it is in the FDA guidance, it's a little bit. I think it will probably get pushed back on that. I think if you don't want to talk about this, don't talk about this. If you're going to talk about this, make sure you talk about it in a more comprehensive manner. Operational considerations, trial design should deal with AD-specific issues, so blinding randomization, consent, infrastructure. Basically, you need to think about this carefully and probably get involved with vendors who know what they're doing on all of these areas. Just be aware that drug supply can be an issue because obviously if you're increasing the sample size or if you're doing adaptive randomization, you need to get into certain areas on short notice that you may not have expected to. If, obviously you can't plan out ahead as you would in a fixed term trial or in a non-adaptive trial. And obviously that's more important if you have multi-regional trials, particularly if some of those regions are in less developed countries. For example, if you're developing, say, malaria medicine, for example. So just be aware that the interaction of the real world and your design need to be taken into consideration, and basically ensure that your interim data can be validated and provisioned in a timely manner. You don't want to have weeks or months of delay between the interim analysis started and the analysis coming to the ITMC. You want timely decisions because while you're waiting for decisions to happen, the trial is still going to be ongoing. You're not going to stop the trial waiting for the interim analysis to happen, or at least that's probably not recommended for sure. And so you should ensure that your processes are in place to ensure that things are happening quickly or as quickly as possible. Once the interim analysis happens, data goes to the IDMC makes a decision, those decisions are reflected in the trial. That cycle should be as fast as possible without undermining the operational validity and integrity of the trial. Documentation, it gives very detailed view of the documentation. It gives, prior to trial, the regulator should have the key, basically all of this information. The key aspects overall should be in the protocol. Some of the adaptation-specific rules, so like the fine-tuned granular details about we're going to increase exactly by this for this conditional power, etc., might want to be limited to an IDMC appendix or the charter's appendix for the IDMC. So you need to make a decision about that to ensure that you don't undermine the integrity of the trial by providing too much information about exactly how the adaptation could do. And I think there are probably some things to happen in terms of informed consent that will probably be come up a little bit in terms of that, like how much consent do you need to give to patients that they know enough about what's going to happen, but without tipping off enough that trialists and the subjects themselves could potentially undermine the integrity of the trial. So you need a rationale of the statistical considerations, the clinical justifications, the development program, the pros and cons versus alternatives you considered, the adaptations that you're going to do, how many, which ones, the rules, the estimate if that's relevant, statistical analysis description, like for the interim adaptations themselves, for the primary, secondary endpoints if you stop, or the safety endpoints if you stop, any sensitivity analysis you're going to have to do. So for example, as I said, if you have an overhang data, you can include the overhang data, or you can do both. Adaptive design implementation, like the assignment of interim analysis, the reviews, the interim decisions, the membership summaries. So basically just like an org chart effectively, and like a chart of all of the who's making decisions and how are they making those decisions. And then confidentiality, like ensuring that the data processes and stuff ensure that there's no data leakage and stuff like that. Who's going to have access to interim data? How are you going to log that? How are you going to provide information to various entities post-adaptation, operating characteristics, that's basically the simulation report that we discussed earlier. And then for the marketing application, you should have all of the above, include, plus the AD implementation. How did things actually happen? When did the interim analysis happen? What decisions were made? Did you check if there was any changes that seemed to occur after the interim analysis? Was there a deviation summary? Data access, make sure that there was compliance with the data access requirements, who had access to data? Do you have any audits or deviations from the initial plan? The deliberations of the IDMC, those should be provided in full, including the minutes and any discussions of adaptations. And there should be adjusted estimates. Obviously, you need these adjusted estimates in the final report that will be used by the regulator for their purposes. And so I think I've run out of time here, unfortunately. I apologize for that. But basically, there's a brief example here that we'll cover in future webinars for group sequential design for survival. But basically, just kind of cover some of the ideas that can happen in a complex trial. If I had time, I would run through this, but I don't. But my colleagues will go through this example in future webinars. And indeed, my colleague, Brian Fox, went through a similar example a handful of months ago for talking about group sequential survival trials and simulation tools in that context. So we've done group sequential design many times in the past. So that and other adaptive designs will be covered in our previous webinar series. So if you want to know more, please get in touch and we'll be happy to send on when we've covered those adaptive designs in detail in previous webinars. So in terms of discussion conclusions, ICH E20 is a major milestone for the adoption of adaptive clinical trials in confirmatory clinical trials. It establishes a principles-based approach to justifying adaptive design, and that I think with enough flexibility that it should allow practice to evolve over time, and that we're not just going to be stuck, here's the adaptive designs that work, here's the ones that don't. I think principle-based approach allows that to evolve over time, and I'm sure there might be, suggestions of editing it or improving it going forward, but I think that, even if it doesn't change, I think the hope will be that it's flexible enough that it will allow that to happen naturally. It covers several common types of adaptive design, such as group sequential design and sample size estimation and treatment allocation, and it provides useful context on specific areas such as simulation study, like simulation for adaptive designs, Bayesian adaptive designs, survival adaptive designs. The comment period is open till November. Let your comments be known. It's very easy to make comments, whether that be the FDA, EMA, or the MHRA, depending on your jurisdiction. Other jurisdictions available. If you want to see the other jurisdictions, you can go to the ICH website. The link is in the references. And I think it is closed for a handful of jurisdictions, but the vast majority of jurisdictions have comments on to the end of November. And I do expect, if you were to give my prediction, some of the conservative language, not things that are said actively like this is bad, but just kind of a skeptical or conservative idea that, okay, how strong the justification needs to be for that design, that will be challenged, I do think. I think there will be some pushback on that. And I think, as I said at the very start, I think this current guidance, it has many, many principles in common with the FDA guidance, which was very warmly viewed by people who are involved in running adaptive clinical trials, but some of the language feels like it's inherited from the European guidance, and I imagine maybe it'll move a little bit closer to the FDA guidance in terms of its tone and its content. I think the content, most people agree, most of it's very, very good. The majority is very, very good. Some of the tone maybe needs to be adjusted a little bit, and I think maybe some emphasis of the advantages needs to be given extra weight in certain scenarios as well. Just to mention, nQuery, we're obviously making updates to this all the time, including to our Pro Adaptive tier. You can see an overview here of our last update in June 2025. We'll have a summary of what's going to be in our next update in December 2025, in our next webinar, which will be run by my colleague, Dennis Desmond, on multi-regional clinical trials. But you can see here an overview of what's in our last update, including a select table overhaul. So I won't have a time to run an example here today, but for example, if you haven't updated to 9.5, you may note here a brand new table select modal. And you can see here on the left-hand side a much more comprehensive and easier to use way to explore, say, the adaptive designs available within nQuery at present. And obviously, we'll continue to expand that selection of options in future updates as well. And just to mention that if you don't have nQuery or you want to try some of the tiers of nQuery you don't currently have access to, you can go to statsolves.com/nQuery-demo, and you can try nQuery for free for 14 days, just your email, no credit cards required. And you can try it within your browser for 14 days and see are there features within nQuery or within the higher tiers of nQuery that might be of interest to you, including our adaptive design features. So as I said, I've run out of time, so I'm not going to have time to answer questions. I do apologize for that, but I do want to thank you so much for attending today. If you want to get in touch, you can email info@statsols.com, and our website provides additional contact options, as well as the additional information on nQuery and on sample size calculations and adaptive designs generally, including all of our previous webinars, which have covered many adaptive design relevant topics in the past. And I mentioned that there's references here at the end of the slide deck, which will be sent to you afterwards alongside the recording, covering adaptive design, the regulatory guidances that I talked about that have been in existence up to now, then the ICH E20 itself, and fairly comprehensive, including some of the ones that are related, like the ICH E9. Then I provided links to all of the analyses that I've been able to find in the public domain on ICH E20, including from EPFSI, from Berry Consultants, from Citel, and from various other news articles. I think this is probably the most comprehensive one-stop shop if you want to see what people are saying about this. For example, there was a very comprehensive discussion on ICH E20 by Berry Consultants, published recently. This link here, which might be of interest. They would obviously have a very positive view of adaptive designs. They're one of the specialists in this area, including in Bayesian adaptive design. So you might see some interesting comments there if you're interested. Obviously, all of the public comments will eventually be published by the various regulators, but if you want to get a preview of that's available there. And then there's some further reading on certain areas, as I mentioned. For example, if you're interested in constant intervals, there was 2 good reviews done there earlier. There's some interesting history articles, such as the Rosenberger from 2020. And the work example, I didn't get to go through today, but that's also here as well. So yeah, once again, I want to thank you so much for attending today's webinar. This was obviously a very information heavy. I think ICH E20 is a huge milestone. I'm really excited to see this happen because, as I say, with ICH, this is an entity that's designed to create harmonization across the globe in terms of what are the kind of expectations, the principles that come with doing any type of thing within a clinical trial, the statistical aspects, the operational aspects. For example, one that's currently in the works is regarding inclusion of pregnant breastfeeding people within clinical trials. So these are really important, and to see this milestone occur, it just means that it'll be much easier and much more prominent, much easier to do adaptive design going forward. So I think it's definitely a positive, and with appropriate appropriate work and intelligence, I don't see why adaptive design can't go from strength to strength in the future years ahead. So yeah, I just want to thank you so much for attending today. I apologize for running a bit over, but I hope some of the additional information was useful. Our next webinar will be on next month on multi-regional clinical trials. I hope we look forward to that. But without any further ado, I want to thank you so much. Hope you have a great day, and goodbye.